If you're being told you must be on performance-enhancing drugs, or you couldn't look the way you do or perform the way you do, and you're not on them, well, that has to be the ultimate fitness compliment. On the 25th of January, CrossFit released a list of a whole bunch of athletes that had taken an out-of-competition drugs test. And, shockingly, considering what happened during the semi-finals, they all came back negative. But looking at this list actually got me wondering about a couple of things. First of all, that it's good because we've requested more transparency with regards to the drug testing protocol within CrossFit. But is this the transparency that we want to see from CrossFit? Because I actually think it's later in the season when we really want to see this. And my other question? Why is Zack George on this list? Well, let's address that one first, and then we'll come back to the question of transparency. Now, when I first started looking through this list, immediately Zack's name jumped out at me. Now, don't get me wrong, Zack is an incredibly fit individual. He competes at an extremely high level within CrossFit. But when we look at the other names on the list, well, they're all Games athletes, many of them multi-time game athletes, podium athletes, CrossFit Games champions. Now, of course, a few others on the list stand out. Think of someone like Christian Holter, who's retired. So I think it's good that we see CrossFit are still testing athletes even though they've officially retired, because we've also observed within CrossFit that retirement doesn't always stick. Another name on the list that stands out is Sarah Sigmundsdottir. Obviously, she's been to the Games many times, but due to an injury, she's been struggling to make it back onto the Games field. But I do think it's good that these athletes are tested in the off-season, because it could potentially be an athlete that is struggling with an injury, that is trying to make it back. Maybe that's the time when the temptation to use a little extra help could really be the strongest. Now, of course, all of these tests came back negative, and I should probably insert here that yes, tests can be beaten. There are ways around tests, and there will be people that, even if we test the athletes 100 times, will never believe that they are competing clean. We could also add, though, at this point, that out-of-competition testing is probably the hardest time to cheat the test, as if you don't know it's coming, it makes it harder to cycle off or something like that. So this is maybe the list we should have the most confidence in when we're considering those that have been tested. But once again, we can go back to our question of why Zack George? Well, it's probably one of a potential three different reasons, and I'll go through them in order of likelihood. So scenario 1, CrossFit just randomly pulled a name out of a hat and it happened to be Zack George, and if it wasn't him, it would have been any other athlete that competed maybe at a semi-final last year. Possible, but I don't think that's the most likely scenario. Now, the reason I think it's more likely one of the next two options is because it's not just Zack George's name that stands out on this list. If they were all in a room together, Zack George would also stand out. He's 6 foot, 100 plus kilograms. He's an absolute unit. Add to that he's a master of big gymnastics, and we see that Zack doesn't quite fit the traditional profile of what we think of a CrossFit athlete looking like. Add to that Zack has a pretty big profile, not just within CrossFit, where within the UK he's by far one of the most recognisable CrossFit athletes, but he's also someone who is recognised outside of CrossFit, having appeared in magazines like Men's Health multiple times. So with all of that, did someone working for CrossFit just decide that you cannot be Zack George without a little chemical help? And it might be nice to think that CrossFit is that conscious of athletes within the space and aware of who people are, and maybe flagging certain individuals that are outliers. Because at times it does feel like CrossFit definitely has a narrow focus on a few favourites, whether that's for good or bad. So yes, it could just be that CrossFit targeted Zack George because they were suspicious, but more likely, I think it's probably this third reason, and that is that somebody else reported to CrossFit that they felt Zack George was using something, and CrossFit responded by making sure that he was added to the list to get tested. And I say that's the most likely reason because it tends to be across the board that that's the way CrossFit works. We see it happen with the trademark issues. We saw it with eligibility issues during the team competition last year. And it would be no different with PEDs. CrossFit rely on the community to police these things and to report to them when they think there is somebody breaking a rule. So if that is the case, then I hate to say it, Zack, but it looks like somebody doesn't like you. Or at least they don't think you can do the things that you do without a little extra help. But like I said before, all the athletes on this list came back negative, including Zack George. So that does mean that when he competes at Strength in Depth Origins this weekend, he's probably the only athlete there that will have been tested by CrossFit beforehand. Now, switching back to the idea of transparency within testing, It is good to get this list to see who's been tested out of competition, but this list also came as a surprise. We were not there waiting to hear who had passed their test. We didn't even know who had been tested until after it happened. But I think when we talk about transparency within the drug testing protocol, what we'd like to see is transparency at different stages of that protocol. And for example, last year with the semi-finals, we would only ever hear about it if someone failed the test, and very often we heard about that from their social media before CrossFit said anything. Now obviously CrossFit cannot release that information until appeals and testing of the B sample and things like that have happened, which is why they're generally later in releasing their information than an athlete that can put it up immediately on their Instagram. But if you're testing 7 athletes and we get reported that 6 athletes have passed that test, well then we know that something is happening with that 7th athlete. Maybe they just need to have the B sample tested because it got contaminated. And then a week later we hear that also they're clean. That's great. We can have trust and faith in the protocol, in the procedure and the way it works. But at the same time, if we know that those 6 are clean and we're unsure about this one, maybe the athlete who is just sitting one spot out of qualifying, at least they can start to make some informed decisions about what they're doing with their life over the coming weeks and months, because there is a chance that they might get called up to compete. And then even if they find out that no, it was just a problem with the test and now the B sample has come back clean and that athlete is going, that's great. Once again, our faith is strengthened in the test. But if it does come back that that athlete has popped, well, it will have been nice that the other athlete who's now going to step up and take their place and actually go to the CrossFit Games, well, they've been able to make some smart decisions with regards to their nutrition and training and not just let go of everything because their season is now over. And once again, no matter what happens, we have more faith in the drug testing protocol. But it would be nice if after the semi-finals we were hearing, yes, these athletes have all passed their tests, and then we have the confidence knowing, okay, they're going to be at the CrossFit Games. How is that going to affect the competition? And then at least we don't have the horrible game that we had last year where we were just waiting to see who was the next athlete that had failed their drugs test. But it is good to see this level of transparency with CrossFit anyway, that they are testing these athletes out of competition in the off season, whether they be games athletes or just people that look superhuman.